Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, the exposure of flight crews to ionizing radiation from the sun. Lindsay Fenwick is a former military and airline pilot with more than 21,000 hours of flight time. Tom Burke is an emeritus professor of public health with an expertise in risk management. They discuss with Dr. Josh Sharfstein a recent report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine about the health risks that flight crews may face and what can be done. Let's listen.
Professor Tom Burke, Lindsay Fenwick, it's great to have you both on Public Health on Call. Now, you are both members of this National Academies committee that wrote a big report about radiation exposure to flight crews. And before we get into the meat of the report, I want to ask each of you how you wound up on this committee. And I'll start with you, Lindsay.
Well, Josh, as you may expect, most of the committee members had PhDs and MDs, epidemiological experience or aerospace physics. The committee felt they needed a pilot, I won't say a token pilot, but somebody who had a career as a pilot and been exposed to ionizing radiation.
And I guess that was you?
That was me.
Tell me about your career as a pilot.
Well, I started off in the New Zealand Air Force, spent some time being educated in the U.S. Air Force. I did corporate VIP flying, and most of my career was as a regular line pilot with a major air carrier.
How many years were you up in the air piloting planes?
So far, it's been in excess of 50 years.
So you've been everywhere, I can imagine.
Well, quite a few places, yes.
Okay, fair enough. Now, Tom, you and I have known each other a long time. How did you wind up on this committee? Lindsay has a very good answer for how he wound up on the committee.
He has a great answer, but actually when I got the call, Josh, I said, well, I'm an environmental science pollution guy. You sure you want me? And actually, I am an epidemiologist, and getting to the bottom of whether an exposure is causing an adverse outcome requires that epidemiologic expertise. In addition, as you know, at Hopkins, I ran the Risk Science Institute and have done mathematical risk assessments. So it's really been one of the most fascinating committees I've been on because it's so interdisciplinary as this challenge is. And the pieces fit together really nicely with practical experience, hands-on cockpit experience, a flight attendants, and all those PhDs and an MD, John Samet, chairing the committee.
Let me ask you this, Tom. How, with your public health background, do you see the issue of radiation and flight crews? What is the public health issue here?
Well, I think first off, there's an increased concern about radiation. We just had an amazing around the moon flight of our astronauts, and I think we've recognized that there's naturally occurring radiation from outer space that we're all exposed to, and that increased the concern. But particularly among flight crew and flight attendants and pilots, there's an increasing concern that this is a major U.S. workforce, almost 300,000 people, and they're not covered by our current radiation protection programs. And there are a lot of unanswered questions about exposure and training and health effects.
Yeah. I mean, not everybody realizes this, but when you're up in the sky, there's more radiation. Is that right, Tom?
Absolutely, even though it's a very small amount for the casual flyer or even professors who have to fly all the time. But flight attendants particularly, and Lindsay can address this, who are flying at higher altitudes and more flights over the poles where there's less protection from this radiation, can, over the course of a career, really have significant exposures.
How close you are to the pole is very important, and generally flights routing very close to the pole do have greater exposure to ionizing radiation. Duration of the flight is important, but also altitude. The airplanes these days are flying much higher than they used to, and there's some technical reasons for that. But once you get up above 40,000 feet, the exposure ramps up. It's not linear. It goes up substantially.
Lindsay, how do you think people who work on flight crews think about radiation?
Well, Josh, during my career, it was barely discussed. And to this day, among most airlines, it's barely discussed. Management doesn't introduce it for fear of perhaps spooking the employee workforce. Pilots have certainly been aware for a number of years the increased risk of melanoma. It's agreed widely. It's about double the risk of the UVA rays, primarily coming through the cockpit windows. And certainly, I'm aware that flight attendants have been concerned, especially with the potential effects of ionizing radiation on pregnancy.
And so it's been sort of, I hate to say this, but below the radar a little bit.
For the most part, that would be a fair assessment.
And so you have this report where the goal is to make the previously invisible visible and actually say, well, what is it that we know about this problem? And Tom, what do we know from a scientific perspective about the nature of the risk for flight crews?
Well, the first step was taking a look at the current information about what the exposure levels are of flight crews. And unfortunately, there is no regular monitoring or tracking of exposure of flight crews. And so there are models that can calculate based upon flight duration and the flight route what potential exposure would be, but there are gaps in those models. The second really important step was to look at the epidemiology. There have been numerous studies and great concern, as Lindsay mentioned, particularly about pregnancy outcomes and miscarriage, but also about cancer. We didn't look at the ultraviolet risks of melanoma, which is well documented, unfortunately, in flight crews, but we did really look at the cancer epidemiology and the reproductive epidemiology and found there again, without good measures of exposure, there's tremendous limitations in what we can conclude. So the science is very inconclusive, but the concern is very high.
Right. If you don't know how much each individual person has been exposed, it's hard to figure out whether there is a relationship between exposure and one of these outcomes.
Absolutely right. And some studies have shown that within flight attendants, there are elevations in certain outcomes, including breast cancer, but others have shown no association. So they deserve a better answer. And we looked at the science in order to formulate an approach to tighten the science and to have a good protection of their health.
Got it. One last question for you on this, Tom, which is, I know that in other fields, people wear around a little device that captures how much they've been exposed. Is that even feasible for flight attendants, anything like that? Did you talk about technology and how it could help with exposure?
We did. We cast a broad net and talked about the technology, and it is a challenging environment, and the aircraft measuring an individual's absorbed dose is not quite like when you have an artificial source like an X-ray technician or a physician, where you know the source of the radiation and the type. Cosmic radiation is complicated and the measurement is complicated, and perhaps Lindsay can add to that. So the dosimetry that we would really like to have presents a challenge, and we've been dependent upon mathematical models to try and estimate that, but they have their limitations.
I see. Lindsay?
Yeah, the committee, Josh, concluded that no single dosimeter would capture the full range of concerning radiation, and that the computational model is probably the way to go, but these models would need to be refined and then validated using a variety of dosimeters on actual flights.
Got it. So there's a big issue of how to go about measuring exposure that really needs to be solved in order to get to the bottom of the level of risk.
And one other interesting thing about aircraft is that the aircraft need to be light to fly. So in a lot of professions, you go to the dentist, you put on a lead protection when you're getting your x-rays. Not going to work for aircraft, right, Lindsay?
Right. The airplanes would be so heavy they'd never get off the ground, but you'd be very well protected.
I think of the airline industry as having some pretty powerful unions for pilots, for flight attendants. Have they gotten involved in trying to assess the risk or figure out additional protections?
They have. The committee didn't delve into that to any degree, but certainly we did get input from representatives of flight attendant associations, and some of them have been quite vocal in their concern for their members' exposure. And I based on the report, which has just come out, my hunch, and this is not an official committee position, my hunch is that the labor groups will seize the opportunity to perhaps leverage this report and see if they can generate some action politically.
So let's talk about the recommendations that you have. One of them is for the Federal Aviation Administration to step up its work on this issue. Lindsay, could you tell us about that?
Yes, Josh. Well, historically, the level of the FAA involvement was to publish an advisory circular, and it's been out for more than 20 years. And it recommends that individual airlines develop and manage a risk management program based on cosmic radiation. Notably, very few airlines have paid much attention to that, and the committee was able to confirm that going forward, there would need to be, and one of the committee recommendations is that the FAA exercise its existing regulatory authority and mandate radiation safety programs for each airline.
Now, Tom, if your phone rang and it was a major airline and they said, we need you to come in and set up a radiation program, what would be top of mind for what you would actually do?
Well, fortunately, Josh, we have made incredible progress with radiation workers, whether that be in the nuclear industry or the medical industry. And there are very solid radiation protection programs that are accountable, that report regularly to the exposed occupational groups. And there are good models out there. The most important thing is the right to know about individual exposure and developing the tools, whether they be models or field verified monitoring, so that individuals can understand their exposure and then through training, give them opportunities to reduce their risk, because there are ways through either routing or route choice, particularly say for pregnant flight attendants, to reduce that. There are ways to manage this risk and for the agencies to work together. But one of the more challenging issues is to get to the bottom epidemiologically to understand long term. And that's going to be a longer process.
Right. And that's kind of a second recommendation of the committee here. So you want the FAA to get the airlines to have these programs, but then getting the science to truly inform those programs is really important. What's part of that recommendation?
Well, there's two big foundations of that. And one is, epidemiology is all about asking the question, do exposed individuals have a higher risk of this outcome than non-exposed individuals? Well, we need to understand exposure. So a good tracking or monitoring program to understand flight crew exposures, to quantify them, to make that information available to the individuals, but also to have it for the industry so that there can be broad understanding of potential risk and the best ways to reduce them. The second part is to track health effects, because there are really challenging issues like latency for the cancers that may not appear until well after retirement. So there's long-term tracking and linking of exposure to health effects. And then there might be instances where, say, during a solar event, where crews were exposed to a short-term but high level of exposure, and registration and following of exposed cohorts will be very important. So getting the science down is feasible. There's lots of people working in the industry. We can do a lot better.
And Lindsay, do you think people would volunteer for those kinds of studies to get to the bottom of this?
I'd like to think they would, Josh. If I could interject here, that buried in the report, and you may have noted it, is that we don't really have to reinvent the wheel here. In Europe, for more than 20 years, the law in the EU states is that airlines must have the sorts of programs of radiation monitoring and mitigation programs that we're talking about. It's just that the US has not followed suit. And not just the EU, in the UK, now in Canada, it's voluntary, but they're pursuing it. In Australia, in South Korea, it's mandatory. So there's quite a bit of data and process models that could be emulated, at least to provide a foundation in the U.S. So, this is, I think, an encouraging aspect here, that we don't have to go back to square one and conjure up something.
It sounds like what's really needed is the commitment to do that, and maybe a coalition. Is that your view, Lindsay?
Absolutely. And from a risk management perspective, the airlines in the U.S. the industry has been hugely successful with partnership programs. And I won't bore you with the acronyms, but there are many operational flight safety programs that are collaborative, that partnership with the regulator, meaning the FAA, the airlines, the employee groups, and in some cases, the manufacturers and other stakeholders. So this partnership model has shown that it is absolutely the way to go. And the committee recommends a collaborative approach going forward.
Got it. Is there a favorite acronym for a safety program that you have?
There are many, but the overarching approach is SMS, Safety Management System. And by law, each airline has to have a safety management system where they identify risks, convert them, identify hazards, try to quantify the risks, and then apply mitigation. So this is pretty much bread and butter for risk management in the airlines, and a radiation safety program would sit very comfortably under that umbrella.
Very good. Tom, any final thought?
We all depend upon safety in the airline industry, and I think we have an obligation to protect the health of our flight crews. The good news is that their current exposures are low and well below the current guidance. There are unanswered questions, though, and there is a need for them to have better information to take individual measures and corporate measures and industry-wide measures to make sure it is, as Lindsay said, part of the overall safety program. So I think we gave the industry and the agencies an opportunity to collaborate on an approach that really brings radiation protection to the flight crews in a way that makes them equal with other folks and hopefully can share the success that we've seen in other radiation workers in lowering their exposure and understanding the risks.
Fantastic. Lindsay, any last word?
No, thanks for the opportunity of giving a little more visibility to this important issue.
Very good. Well, I won't look at an airplane quite the same way. After this conversation, I really appreciate both of you for joining.
Thank you, Josh.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Rachel Walsh. Audio production by Michael Bonfils, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from J.B. Arbogast, Spencer Greer, and Chip Hickey. Distribution and social media by Rachel Walsh, with support from Nick Moran and Brianna Iacovelli. Follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Public Health Pod for more public health takes and special content. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.